The Mongols, everyone's favorite exception. If you also watched Crash Course History when you were younger, poor memories. But the Mongols were one of the largest empires in world history. In a very short amount of time, they conquered a huge tract of land, starting in the 13th century, spreading across much of Asia, and then even pushing into Europe itself before all collapsing again. The Mongols are one of the most interesting people from history, and most people have heard of the Mongol Empire, particularly their famous exploits with Genghis Khan. Many people also know that they did in fact reach Europe, and even held parts of Eastern Europe for quite some time. But in this video, I'm curious, what can still be seen of this Mongol heritage? Are there still loanwords, for example, that have come from Mongolian? Well, the Mongols, as I already mentioned, spoke the Mongolian language. During the time of the 13th century, when they had their great expansion out from the plains, out from the steppes, they were speaking a language that was called Middle Mongolian. That language has developed and changed into modern Mongolian today, which is spoken by around 6 million people. That's spoken both in Mongolia, the country, but also in China, where a bordering area is called Inner Mongolia. And this is where there are also Mongols who live there and who also speak Mongolian. Now, the Mongolian language sits in the Mongolic language family. There were several languages that were spoken which have gone extinct, but today the main ones that remain are Mongolian on the one side and Dagur, which is spoken actually in part of China today. There's also several sub-dialects and different versions, like Khalkha, for example. And we're not too sure about the prehistory of Mongolic, where these languages came from exactly. We think that they were closely spoken in an area that was very close to where the Proto-Turkic language was being spoken. So the ancestor language of Turkish, but also several other Central Asian languages. Now, the Mongols took their language with them when they conquered their empire. And there are actually several Mongolian loanwords, even in English. Now, the word Khan doesn't actually seem to be a direct loanword from Mongolian, but rather to have come into English from a Turkic root. And that's because in the Middle Mongolian language, you can see that it's more something like Kakhan, with a fricative in the middle of the word, whereas Khan is this shortened version as it became in Turkic. But ultimately, it probably comes from a shared root of the word, meaning male ruler. And that's where Genghis, which is sort of means universal, and Kakhan, which is ruler, so the ruler of the universe. There's also the word Ger, which is another word for yurt. Kurultai, a council of war. A morin khur, which is this stringed instrument, a kind of horse head violin almost, it looks like. A jud, which is an extreme steppe weather event, can either be hot or cold with snow or with drought. An ovu, which is a shamanistic cairn. They do have these places, and I think I'm getting the pronunciation here right, called owos. And these are they are like cairns in a way, but then they have been venerated and they build things on top of the cairns, a lot of the time with the little flags you see there. These are representative of the various deities of Tengri as well, the various spiritual forces, and it's believed that spirits of the ancestors and of animals and other important beings inhabit these places. A shagai, which are knuckle bones of sheep or goats that are used in gaming. Now you might be thinking, well, if these are Mongolian loanwords, I've heard of Khan, but the rest of them I've never heard of. And you're probably right, because these are loanwords, but they're what's called learned loans. So really, these only ever appear in a specifically Mongolian context. You don't really talk about Shagai and Ger and Ovu every day, apart from if you're doing something with the Mongols, really. So these aren't exactly loanwords in a very common sense, like that the word skirt is a loanword which you would use pretty much every day, right? So there is a language in Europe that has more of these kinds of loanwords, let's say more everyday loanwords that aren't solely learned and used in a context when talking about Mongolia specifically. Now, this area was invaded for the first time in 1223 and then properly annexed in 1237. And it is, of course, the Russian steppe, the area around Moscow, which was burnt to the ground by the Mongols. Now, the Russian language today has several Mongol loanwords, or at least we think they come from Mongolian because they're often very similar to other words. Now, one that is almost certainly from Mongolian is this word mirin, which is a word for a male horse that has had its parts removed, a gelding, you might call it. And this looks very similar to this word murin in Middle Mongolian that you can see. It's also in that name for the horse head violin that we saw earlier as well. That makes sense. Another interesting one is the word bagatir, and this is a word for a hero or a heroic warrior. Now, in fact, this is a really old word that we also find in Turkic languages, for example. This was kind of a heroic status that was given to various impressive champions or warriors of the steppe culture. And this is one of those words that has come from Mongolian, in this case most likely, or perhaps also a different Turkic language like Tatar that has then been adopted into the Russian language and used. Now, what's interesting is that we obviously saw that the word Kachan became the word Khan, so that interior fricative was lost. Well, we have a similar situation here where this older word in Turkic or Middle Mongolian was something like Bagatur. And then in modern Mongolian, this word has become Baatar. And that word, heroic warrior is still the meaning, is actually found in the name of the Mongolian capital, Ulaanbaatar. And this Ulan means red, and so we have really the city of the red hero. And actually, this isn't an ancient name that goes back to Genghis Khan or before this time period, but rather it's from 1924, and it was used to honor one of the heroes of the Communist Party in Mongolia at this point when they had become a communist country. So that's quite interesting that it goes back there. There is actually another cognate in English to this word of Bagatir or Baatar, which is from the Indian languages, because an offshoot of the Mongols, who became known as the Mongols, eventually found their way into India and became rulers there, the Mughals. And there is a word that is called Bahadur, and this is found in various languages and is also a learned borrowing into English. And it's also a name, I believe, so there's people from the Indian subcontinent who are called Bahadur, and then this is because of this link back to the Mongols. Now, another word in Russian that we find that may come from the Mongols is the word Karaul, which is for a watchtower. I feel like if there's any Age of Empires 3 players, did anyone build any of these? Or maybe it's a krepos that I'm thinking of, but let me know in the comments. Also, Yesaul, which is a rank for a captain in the Cossacks, and a konura, which is a kennel where dogs were kept. So that's quite an interesting one. So that's more of a less specific example. And a bulak, which is quite a specific one. It's probably from Balag in Mongolian. And this word relates to someone who pulls a ship along the shoreline. Now, a lot of the time this was done with draft horses to pull ships over canals. You can see that in quite a lot of paintings, for example, from sort of the Industrial Revolution and afterwards in England. But another way to do it was simply to have the sailors get out or to employ people to drag these ships. And there's images of this from the Netherlands as well, so it's not just that this happened in Russia. But it's quite interesting that this may come from a Mongolian loanword. Were they the ones to actually introduce this system to force the Slavic peasants to work for them in this way, and that's why it has been remembered? It's interesting to think about. Unfortunately, there's not many sources. I don't speak Russian. I can't read Russian really. So maybe Russian speakers in the chat will be able to, in the comments, will be able to enlighten me a bit more. Now, as I already briefly mentioned, a lot of these words may come from Turkic, and there are a lot more words in Russian that definitely come from Turkic languages. Of course, the Russians ended up conquering, or the ones from Moscow ended up conquering quite a lot of different Turkic-speaking peoples in to the east and to the south. So it makes sense that a lot of words would have come in from there. The thing with the Mongols really is that while they conquered this huge empire, it was really quite short-lived. It didn't really last that long. And also, it's not like there were waves and waves of colonizers that came with the invasion. So actually, the interaction of your average East Slavic speaker with a Mongolian speaker wouldn't have happened that often. There was the military wing, the army, the tax collectors, And then for the rest, there weren't a lot of people that were actually there. So that interaction, which is a prerequisite for the exchange of words and of language, it didn't really come about in the same way. Now, we do know that in Middle Russian, so in the older form of the language, there were more Mongol loanwords. That seems clear. But a lot of these following the period of Mongol subjugation, which ended in Russia already in the 14th century, that after that, they simply weren't needed. And many of them just completely fell out of use. And we only have a couple of them that are actually left. So the Mongols were really kind of a blip on the record. They came, they saw, they conquered, and then they left pretty soon afterwards. That's very different to, for example, a linguistic contact situation like we get in the Danelaw in England with the Vikings. These Norsemen that came over and brought their families, integrated into a local population. That's where we see tons of Old Norse loanwords that appear in English and even more in certain dialects. This simply isn't the case with the Mongols. They're a lot more peripheral. There's not that large-scale contact that happens, and so we don't find many Mongol loanwords surviving today. Thank you so much for watching. Really appreciate it. Let me know in the comments below if you enjoyed it. Support me on Patreon if you like what I do, and I will see you in the next video.